Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Earth Day Everyday podcast, where we aim to spotlight exemplary activists, policymakers, and changemakers in the field of sustainability and climate change. I'm your host, Aryan Doshi, and today we are extremely lucky to be joined by Peg. Peg is a National Geographic explorer and mentor and is a director of innovation and social impact at the GEMS World Academy. Peg, it is absolutely wonderful to have you with us today.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, so I guess first question, maybe just to get started. I mean, as someone who has, worked as a National Geographic explorer, someone who's worked with different environmental interfaces, tools, connecting that with social impact. I mean, for you, like, where did it all begin? And when was that moment that you knew you wanted to be a part of this and really join the climate environmental science space?
So tricky because I can go back to times when I was a kid and I was, listening to cicadas and wondering about their periodic time cycle. But I think my latest passion when it comes to environmental impact and data collection is probably in 2017 when I went to Antarctica as a
Wow.
National Geographic and Lindblad Expedition Grosvenor Fellow. And there is just something about going to these remote places that fills you with awe.
Yeah.
And you just come back transformed and feeling like you have to do something to protect it. You have
Yeah.
to do more,
Absolutely.
right? So it was through that experience and talking to my kindergarten students at
Wow.
school, I came
Yeah.
back and showed them all these photos of penguins, and they were really more interested in the rules of how we keep Antarctica pristine.
Yeah.
So they were interested in the waste. So when I told them that you were not allowed to bring snacks onto the continent as a tourist or as a
Yeah.
scientist in this scenario, they were just shocked. There's no snacks, no
Yeah.
snacks, and it
Yeah.
led to this really great discussion about how do we have rules that keep our places safe and clean and free of
Absolutely.
pollution. So that suddenly we all became really passionate about wondering where does our waste go and
Yeah.
what do we do. So that's what really kickstarted a lot of my engagement with students around how do we document pollution, how are we keeping track of it, and what change can we make in our own little area that will then impact the world.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know you're talking about visiting these remote places and also about how you're not allowed to bring any snacks, any waste to those locations. And on that sort of note, can you maybe talk about, the tourism industry that we've been seeing and maybe the impact on that in all these places? Like many people think that by, visiting these isolated remote locations, they're doing a favor to the environment, but in reality, just them being there can sometimes have a negative impact if they're not careful. And so can you just maybe talk about, the tourism industry from your.
It's so yeah, it's so tricky, and you have to be really careful about who are you traveling with and ensuring that you're traveling working with people who are following the rules. So when you travel to Antarctica, it's an Antarctic treaty that governs how people travel and navigate that space.
Wow.
So there's rules like how many ships can be in a certain area at a time, and there's people checking when you go to these remote places, even like Galapagos. Like there are people
Yeah.
checking that you're following the rules of those spaces. So before you travel, it's really important to ensure that the people that you're entrusting yourself with are
Yeah.
following the rules of that ecological environment to keep it really safe. So,
Yeah.
because there's a ton of rules that they have to follow because all of these governments and spaces are trying to keep it as pristine as possible. So know before you go, do your research and ensure.
For sure, absolutely. And just one more thing on that note of Antarctica before we may move on is I know a major topic that we constantly keep seeing in the news is all this melting ice, and many people based on where they live they view that as like a distant topic. Melting ice, Antarctica, so far away. How is it ever going to impact me? And so can you just maybe talk about how melting ice is in many ways like the origin of our climate problem and maybe talk about its seriousness and its significance from your journey.
Yeah, I think one thing that we can all do as educators and people who are trying to be a better science communicator is help people understand all of these indicators of climate change, right? And the glacial retreat and the volume of glacial water
Yeah,
occurring because of glacial retreat and melting is one indicator. It's one piece that we have
yeah,
of telling the story of change over time, right? And you can tell it through the lens of botany, of temperature, sea change and sea level temperature. And there's all of these connected pieces together.
yeah.
And I think it's our role, our job as citizens of the planet to really kind of be aware of these change over time.
Absolutely. And like you were saying, when you talk about being respectful, sort of like of all of these species of the ocean, of the glaciers, and really our Earth, right? Because this is our Earth, but we really have to have a stake in it today if we want to see the Earth of tomorrow. And maybe on
It's
that
true,
note
and
of ocean, yeah, no, no, go ahead, go
it's
ahead.
true. It's really tricky, like you said, to make a place like Antarctica feel known to people.
Yeah,
And I think one way you can explore kind of climate change and our changing Earth is to look into data and your own location, whether
yeah,
that's temperature data or weather data, but to really look at your own environment wherever you are
yeah.
and see if you can find and observe some change over time.
Patterns. Yeah, I think patterns and looking at sort of the statistics because there's nothing more powerful than the data and the numbers. That's probably gonna validate what we're seeing in real life and hopefully maybe alter some of the people who say it's not an issue today. So definitely. Can you also talk maybe about the problem of, plastic waste? We're talking about the Antarctic and also the oceans. And today we're seeing marine species in particular, turtles, all of the marine species specifically impacted by plastic. And that sort of goes back to the waste issue you were talking about. Um, in today's world of consumer culture and consumption, we're seeing a lot of products just end up in the landfills, end up on our beaches, and they get washed in the shores. And so, do you sort of have any maybe insight as to how we can solve that problem because at the top our oceans might seem sort of like pristine and clean, but if you think about like the Great Pacific Garbage Patch beneath all that, that's where we have all the plastic. And so do you have maybe any solutions like what do you think we can do to address this?
Yeah, it's even smaller. It's even down to the fibers of our
Yeah,
clothing, right? So we are noticing the observable trash maybe in our neighborhoods and
right,
areas we live, but it's even down to the plastic and the clothes that we wear.
sure,
So
yeah,
there are different levels of impact we can have. And the goal is to make larger changes down the consumption line,
yeah,
right? The goal is to have companies and legislature and we can kind of start with that groundswell locally of getting people more aware of the choices that they're making.
yeah,
That will help us kind of influence those larger partners of companies to make choices and really it's policy change
yeah,
and how can we work together to make those much bigger influence on the companies and
yeah,
legislature. So but any kid can start, any grown up, anybody can start because it's about informing the people around you
yeah.
to gather momentum to make those big forward changes.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you mentioned the word policy there, and I think it is so relevant to how we're seeing the current climate issue. Can you maybe talk, maybe even just a little bit more about policy and its impact not only on waste, but really all facets of this climate issue? Because if we don't have the support of maybe NGOs, governmental organizations, I know the EPA is big in the United States in terms of being able to make those regulatory changes and enforcement. So can you maybe just talk bit more about maybe the successful policy that what you've seen and what impact you think it can have in the future?
Yeah, it's so tricky because every location has different needs, right? And there's a big movement towards single-use plastic bans or plastic bag bans. But with each one of those, you have to consider how is it impacting the larger population, right? So there's a big ban for straws, but then we have to consider, well, who uses straws? And
Absolutely.
part of our population of people who are seeking accessibility, like do require straws. So it's been really interesting as a human-centered design process of like how has this item impacted the population? And how do we have to consider them as we promote legislation? And what do we have to, if we're not providing plastic bags, what are we providing as an alternative? So we're really having to think holistically as we
Yeah,
think about making these policy changes move forward. And you're thinking about in your space, in your town, in your place, what are people's needs and how can we adapt to those needs? So,
absolutely.
in all of these little pockets of the world, people are making these legislature changes that fit for their area
Mhm.
because it's not going to be a one size fits all
Yeah,
issue unless you're thinking about these global companies that have that widespread impact,
absolutely, for sure.
right? So
Yeah.
it really is that local momentum, that local small of what is going to make the most meaningful change in your neighborhood, in your area,
Yeah.
and then how can we spread that as a much larger.
Yeah, yeah, and I think what you said there is so true, right? When we think about policy, it's almost as if we're weaving this thread like an ecosystem of connection, sort of trying to take every organization, take every person, and just merge them together to form this movement that we can ultimately use in the fight against this climate crisis. And I think that sort of brings up another point, which is that this sort of crisis that we're in, I mean, there's definitely a negative impact, but there's also this sense of unity as well and togetherness that people maybe don't often see in the current climate situation. And so, can you maybe talk about that sense of togetherness and that acting as a positive side, and how can we sort of infuse that into the narrative today?
Yeah, I think the most positive change we can make is through storytelling.
Yeah,
And I think we are at a point where we can see so much information about the world, yet we're not sharing enough of the stories that are going to make that change to really
yeah,
unify us. I
absolutely.
just feel like we don't know enough about how our neighbors around the world are being impacted by the climate crisis and what is life like for them. How
Yeah,
has this change impacted them? So my hope is that through storytelling, that we
yeah,
can be more united, that we can be more empathetic to our changes. We see this happen, especially with animals, right?
yeah,
Like all of my students, when we talk about a thing like climate crisis or pollution, they're like,
yeah,
turtles.
yeah,
Turtles are our most
yeah,
important
yeah,
savable species. And they're so attracted and drawn to that. Even when I teach all over the world, everyone is so, they're so impacted by those images. But
yeah,
how can we make people and the impacts that it's having on people more a part of that story, right? I feel like people are not connected enough to the system. Like you mentioned, that we are so connected by systems in this
yeah,
climate crisis, but there's not enough understanding or storytelling that's visible about the impact of that system and how it impacts people and the ecosystem, right?
absolutely. Yeah, no, I think that's so true. It's really about altering the systemic change that we see in policy today so that we can have the change that we wish to see for the future. So I think that is so relevant and that is so true. I guess one more sort of maybe mindset to address is this notion of companies and corporations today, when they think of sustainability, when they think of the environment, I mean, their first thing is about cost, right? And so, for example, you look at the restaurant industry, we sort of want to get us on a trajectory where we're using sustainable packaging, or we're able to maybe have home delivery items with drones. So we're not able to, so we don't use cars emitting fossil fuels, but that'll cost money, that'll cause testing programs. And so there's a lot of behind the scenes, maybe operations and cost to transition a company from unsustainable to sustainable. And so how can we sort of um, change maybe that mindset of not money first, but rather environment first for these corporations?
Yeah, I think again, it's storytelling. And
Yeah,
how do we convince people to make the change that's going to be long lasting in the long run for the future of generations,
yeah,
right? I think just as you said, people are really thinking in the right now.
yeah,
What's going to save me money today, and not really thinking about, what is the impact of this
yeah,
beyond this week. So I think that we have to make better storytelling about the change, and then again, it's this momentum forward.
yeah,
How can we in our local communities work together with organizations, work together with companies? Because I think there's also a fallacy that people don't want it. They
yeah,
want convenience, they want easy. So we have to work in collaboration, but because with every sustainable choice, there's also cons to that choice too.
Yeah,
Even like renewable energy, right? Wind farms, wind energy, but that's a huge um, reason that a lot of birds and
yeah,
bats, right? So there's each of these pieces has some pros and cons, and we have to work together in
that's
collaboration
awesome.
to let people know that this is what the constituents want. This is what the customer is seeking, and it's worth it for our future generations to make that
Yeah.
choice.
Yeah, and I know you mentioned some of the cons of maybe forms of renewable energy like wind, and that sort of brought up another thing where you think about electric vehicles today. If you think about their origin, the batteries made of lithium and copper, where does that originate? Through child labor in many of the developing countries. And so I think it sort of goes back to thinking of people of today and right now, right? How are they affected by climate change? Because you might not see it like in the environment that you're in today, but out there, there actually are real world people being impacted by this, like you said. So I think that that is so true, so relevant. Can you maybe talk about how can we sort of elevate technology and use technology to supplement the current climate situation? I know you were talking about how you use data and numbers to amplify the impact that humans are having, that we're seeing from a maybe weather standpoint. And so can you maybe talk about using models, using data and using numbers to paint that story, to create that story like you were talking about?
Yeah, at least in education, there's this concept in teaching, especially with computational thinking, problem solving, that people have these objects to play with. And for me, that data, looking at that data and being able to analyze it over time, are these objects that will help people get to that conclusion of what are we noticing? What patterns and trends are we seeing?
Yeah,
So as much as there's so much data in the world, and I think it's part of our jobs as science communicators and educators is to pull this data so that people can start to make sense of it on their own. So as an educator and a technologist, I really like to help people collect their own data.
yeah,
And that's what I do with like debris tracker. That's what I do with my students, where they collect their own data, they put it into a map, and they can start to analyze it and
wow,
see it.
absolutely.
And I just think it's, always asking the question of how can we make the data more meaningful for people?
Yeah,
Because then they will be motivated to then make change. And another project I did with it was during COVID, like
wow,
the peak of the COVID crisis,
yeah,
March 2020, when kind of the world shut down for us in Chicago. We were only allowed to go for a walk once a day. You could only get groceries and you're
yeah,
only allowed to go outside for a walk. So
yeah,
on my daily walk, I started to notice a new debris that was not on anyone's list. And
yeah,
that was PPE, the masks and the
yeah,
gloves. And I started to share about it on Instagram and Twitter on my daily walks, how much I was finding and what was I noticing.
yeah,
And my other plastic researchers in Canada, they noticed it too. And this launched this 60 countrywide
wow,
PPE tracking project
that's
because it was a piece of data
yeah,
that we just didn't wasn't on anyone's list
yeah.
before that peak of COVID hit. So my mind is always thinking of how can I connect people to data and how can we use that data to tell a story and then motivate change.
Yeah, no, that's I think that's an amazing story. You saw what you saw and then expanded the impact to have essentially a global impact. So I think that's so powerful and meaningful, especially when we're talking about the climate, right? Because I think there is that mindset of how am I as one person going to make any impact in a world that's constantly expanding, constantly growing out. And maybe can you just address that? Like when someone's entering the field, how do they know the impact they're going to have when you maybe saw that PPE, you didn't know the recognition that it would come to have going forward. But you took the word to social media, Twitter, created that small movement. So can you talk about that? Like entering the field, you start off at one person, but how do you maybe have the foresight and the vision to keep going?
Yeah, I think that really is the beauty and power of social media at this point in history is it lets you kind of immediately amplify your personal story. And
Mhm.
it does make you feel less alone, that maybe there's someone out there who's seeing what I'm seeing. And that was what was so surprising about sharing my PPE. I started the hashtag with Justine tracking PPE
Wow. Wow.
in the hopes that like other people would share what they're seeing. And they did. Friends from all over the world, friends in the Philippines were then sharing the photos that they had in their place. So I think you as a person don't necessarily know the impact you can have, but if
Yeah,
you take the risk and you're open-minded and you're willing to share a little bit of your story, it
yeah,
could be exponential. And
yeah.
that other people, you could help other people feel less alone in their fears and concerns. And maybe you can start a global movement with your story too.
Absolutely.
There's
No,
a great website that's also similar to this. It's called I See Change.
yeah.
And it is people, I don't know if you've heard about this, it's another citizen science movement of people telling their stories of floods that they're noticing,
Wow.
extreme
Yeah.
temperature. And it's kind of a climate community of people who are live sharing their images. And
Yeah.
I think if more people were taking to social media or those platforms,
Absolutely.
that we would be amplifying all those stories.
Yeah, no, I think that word storytelling really perfectly captures maybe how we want to view the current climate situation, because only if we see the people, we tie it in with the data, we create this story and sort of like package it up while we're portraying it, while we're talking about it, projecting it to other people, will the message resonate, and will we get these people to join and create this movement really? And I think the way you were talking about using technology, using data, it sort of brings up this another aspect, which is that the environmental field, I mean, is interdisciplinary, right? You can connect anything you want, whether your love for data, your love for numbers, you brought that in to show climate trends. And so can you talk about maybe how other people in other fields, like what can they do to wherever they're at, whatever sector they're working in, tie that in with the environment to make an impact?
Yeah, I think again, that's the beautiful part of storytelling is that it's not just for people who are talented writers or videographers, that there's so much more open in this space, especially for people who are artists. Like I think you had previously on my friend Kat Owens, who is
Yeah.
like such an inspiration to me. When it comes to like what do we do with the waste that we find and how can we inspire a more sustainable future, there's also amazing people like Jill Pelto who takes the data and she creates these beautiful murals where the artwork tells the story of the trend in the data.
Yeah, wow.
And there's amazing podcasters and audio storytellers. There's so many ways that interdisciplinary that you can contribute to this larger storytelling. And I think what's most important is people finding what they're so passionate about, what their special strength or skill is, and then using that strength to then, bring it towards this work.
Yeah,
And there's room for that.
for sure. And I think that word storytelling, yeah, it perfectly captures it. The interdisciplinary part perfectly captures how we sort of need to approach this climate movement. I guess going back to maybe the legislation and policy side of it, I know you had brought up how we can sort of bring about systemic change. Can you maybe talk about the climate legislation that we have seen? I know Paris Accords was in 2015. Before that, we had the Montreal Protocol. But can you maybe talk about, do you think that the ambitious goals we've set in the Paris Accords, whether it's no carbon emissions, let's go net zero, like many countries are not on track. And so what's the next step from there? I mean, are we just going to keep on having these conferences, or what is going to be the solution to really make us all accountable and have that sense of accountability?
I think that's the question of the hour,
Yeah,
right? I think you asked the question that everyone is asking is how do we hold, big business accountable? How do we create regulations that are going to move us towards our ambitious goals for a more sustainable planet? And I think the reason you make ambitious goals in life or in climate is so you have something to work towards,
yeah,
right? And I think we have to ask questions like, well, who enforces these regulations to ensure we can get to a better climate future? And I think it does start small. It starts small with people who really care enough to pressure legislation, enough to pressure to get that regulation in there. Because if we don't have a regulation for that, or a subsidy to create more sustainable technology or alternatives, then how are we getting towards that goal? Actionable tasks. So you're asking the right questions.
yeah.
And we need more people who are pressuring and asking the right questions because I don't know if we'll reach it if we're not having these tasks to get us there.
Yeah, no, I think that that is so true, right? It's a sense of accountability, asking questions, and maybe always having this sense of pressure on our local government, on our politicians, and really forcing them into action in the right trajectory that we know as environmentalists we have to have. Maybe just a few more questions here. I guess when we're talking about, policy, right? One other thing that also comes to mind is this idea of the global north and global south, right? We talk about the global north, and they're responsible for like over 90% of emissions. But we also have the technology to address it. I know we were talking about technology earlier, whereas the global south is responsible for really only a much smaller percent of the emissions, and yet they're the ones facing the brunt of it. And so, can you maybe talk about, do you see, like, maybe this is sort of a broad question, but inter-country collaboration, like so many countries today, when you think about foreign relations, they have their own interests in mind, right? Whether it be for the energy sector, fossil fuels, oil playing a dominant field in how countries view each other, make relationships, allies. And so it's really this sort of deep question, but do you think countries can come to a common consensus and have this collaboration that this is an issue that affects us all, or will it rather just be, self-centered on this is our needs?
Yeah, I'm not sure in your area what this feels like, but in our area, this is a conversation about environmental justice.
Yeah,
And even in where I'm at, there's conversations about if we're making a recycling plant, where should that recycling plant live?
absolutely,
Because the outputs of that plant are going to impact the people locally.
for sure.
So I think we have to think much smaller about kind of the impact of the changes that we're making, even through sustainability. And through storytelling and through seeing some of these issues that we're having in the global south and in the global north, telling these stories again. I know I keep saying storytelling, but
Storytelling, no, it's such an important
we
word.
I don't think that people can grow empathy
Yeah,
towards the issue until we know what's happening, until we recognize that impact. And like I said, we're thinking really big globally about how are our choices impacting someone else's life and how are we all interconnected through the system. But even those sustainable choices are having issues at home.
mm,
And we think we're being more sustainable because we're creating maybe more factories that'll repurpose, but where you place that factory is going to impact those people. How do you make that choice?
yeah,
You
for
know,
sure.
who has to suffer for a more sustainable choice?
Yeah,
That's a huge issue for us right now, is environmental justice.
yeah,
Um, and what we're noticing, at least in Chicago, a big issue is that a lot of those plants and places are only in one part of the city,
yeah,
and they're not in, so as much as we're thinking about global collaboration
yeah.
and local collaboration, the only way we can unite over a more sustainable and equitable change is through telling the story.
Absolutely. I think, like you said, right, we first start off small, spread the message within our local communities, those who were able to reach to tell that story, and then only then will we be able to expand. So no, I think that is such a moving message, but also something that I think will take us to where we want to go in the upcoming decade, really, when we're talking about the current climate situation. I guess maybe just one last question is, like, when you talk about the climate crisis today, right? When someone is just entering the field, I like to end off on an aspiring environmentalist question is, I mean, where do you start and where you go? Where do you go? Because the field is so broad, and sometimes it can feel hard to know what your impact is going to be. And you found a way to connect environmental engineering, environmental justice, storytelling, and social impact, merge that all together to really create change, meaningful change. But for someone who's just entering the field, where can they go to find that change? How can they find that change? And really, I guess, where do they start so someday they have the impact that you've been able to have?
I think the number one advice I have is to stay curious.
Yeah.
You know, be a curious person, ask more questions, and the best and most immediate change that you can make is in your local environment.
Yeah.
So as we think about these big global issues, as I learn more about the climate data and temperature data, the first thing I do is think about what does it mean for my location.
Sure.
And the best change you can make is the one that is closest to you. Or is it related to something you're really passionate about?
Yeah.
I think what I would hope for every person is that they're finding that thing that they're passionate about and following it, and just keep going, keep persisting, even in the face of feeling like, that we're not necessarily reaching our goals. We need people to stay persistent, to keep
Yeah.
and follow that
Keep going.
curiosity. So definitely start small, start with what makes you curious, and don't stop.
Yeah, absolutely. Like you said, it's having that tenacity to keep going, despite not knowing really where you're gonna end up. It's almost as if when you start off, you don't know the vision, but only where you get to where you are can you reflect and look at the steps that you traced to get to where you are and realize that's how I went from where I was to where I am today. So I think starting off small is the way to go when we're talking about a global issue like this. But thank you so much, Peg, for taking the time to join us on this podcast, sharing all your advice. The word storytelling, I think, will resonate with so many viewers as well, because to really empathize and allow people to lean in to what we're trying to say, I really do think storytelling is at the heart of this. So thank you so much for joining us, and thank you so much to our viewers as well.
Thank you for having me, and stay curious, everyone. Take care.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Peg, and we'll see you all on the next episode of Earth Day Every Day. Thank you so much, everyone.